Well, hello again, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Captain Chris Nolan from Sea Semester for the second broadcast of the Robert C. Seamans journey across the Pacific. She's currently on passage from Hawaii to the west coast of the U.S. to Southern California. Well, let's check in with Captain Burkaw on the Robert C. Seamans, see how they're doing. They're just a bit north of Honolulu. They've been underway for a few days, and we just talked to him by phone a few minutes ago.
Yeah, we're doing well. It was a little sporty last night. The wind stilled in. Got up to 4.7 for a little while, but things have mellowed out now. But we're up definitely into temperate waters. It's gray and misty out, sort of foggy, and the sun burns through periodically, but definitely not the tropical blue of just a few days ago. Just the nature of this present cruise track, because of the weather and all, we're actually about 200 miles closer to Anchorage, Alaska, than we are to San Diego. So it's sort of funny that in order to get where we're going, as you well know with the sailboat, you can't always go in a straight line. Over.
While the Seamans was docked in Honolulu for a much-deserved break from their voyage from New Zealand to Hawaii, and before they begin the second leg of their voyage from Hawaii to California, they did send off a hard drive with a few videos and photographs from the journey. A pretty epic journey for sure. It looks like the crew's having fun, and Captain Burkaw reports that everything is going well. In today's broadcast, we've got special guest Dr. Malloy, a prolific author, a former Sea Semester faculty member. She's currently writing a book about Americans in the Pacific in the 19th century. And also joining us, Dr. Witting, professor of Oceanography at Sea Semester, and the virtual chief scientist for this journey. Mary, how are you doing?
Nice to be here, Chris. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like you're writing a pretty interesting book that's really apropos for this voyage that the Robert C. Seamans is going on. Can you tell us more about that?
Indeed. In fact, a lot of this sort of gelled for me when we were out in Monterey, the three of us, last year doing the Stanford at Sea program. I was interested in looking at environmental impacts of Americans in the Pacific and in the extraction, especially of a couple of resources, one being sea otters and another being sandalwood. And so I'm going to talk a bit about a voyage on a ship called the Sultan of Boston that left Boston in August of 1815 and didn't return until almost exactly 4 years later, on September 4th, 1819. And this is a voyage that the ship left Boston, went around Cape Horn, went up the North Pacific, and directly to Alaska. And so it actually ties in with what you were talking about, because they wanted to go to the coast of California, but cruised down the coast, and so going along with the current that is there. So they arrived in Alaska at Sitka in August of 1816, and the objective there was first to trade with the Russians and see if they could get sea otter pelts there, to trade with indigenous people, Haida and Tlingit people, in the northern part of British Columbia and the southeast coast of Alaska. But then also to do something which Americans were just then really exploiting, and that is, with the cooperation of the Russians, to bring indigenous Kodiak and Alutiiq people from Alaska down to the coast of California with their indigenous watercraft and hunt sea otters there on the coast of California. And this was totally illegal because Spanish law prohibited it. But this particular journal that I'm going to talk about has some descriptions of that, and I'm going to talk about two places where this ship went. One is to San Diego, and the other is to Hawaii, because these are places that the Seamans is in on this particular voyage. So on the coast of California, when they went to San Diego, they met there with two people, and the Spanish had taken over California from the indigenous people through two separate organizations. One was the military, and the other is the Catholic Church. And this is a very interesting case because the captain of this ship, the Sultan, met with both the commandant of the fort and also with the padre who was in charge of the mission. And he traded with them, and we'll bring up this document eventually and show what it was that was traded. It looks like it says that he's trading with the Doctor Commandante, but DR is an abbreviation at this time for debitor. So this is who's buying stuff versus who's selling stuff. So basically, they are providing to the commandant there clothing and textiles, tobacco, rice, a dozen white plates, a dozen tumblers, glasses. There were places on the coast of California where they got cows for beef. Again, all this is illegal. The Spaniards are not supposed to be trading with Americans because the Spanish want to control all the trade within the sort of realm of Spanish ships. But these guys needed stuff, and so they were happy, in fact, to get it when they could. In exchange, they gave 16 sea otter skins, $10, other at $10 a piece, which is a pretty good price because at that time they're going to take them to Canton and get about $40 for each sea otter pelt at that point. And they also deal with Padre Mendoza and also give him textiles, sugar, rice, tobacco, plates. They were clearly in need of plates, knives, and forks on the coast of California at that time. So this was kind of a nifty trade. At the same time, they have their Alutiiq and Kodiak hunters with them, and they gathered about 3,000 sea otters. So we can see what is going to begin the big decline of sea otters on the coast of California. In that season, that summer season, more than 8,000 sea otters were taken from the coast of California by American ships with these native Alaskan hunters under the control of the Russians. So an interesting kind of business that's going on with Americans on the coast of California 200 years ago. One of the interesting things to me about this particular voyage, and it's very well documented, I mean, things that survive from it include the captain's logbook, the letters of instructions that are given by the owners of the ship, and basically he is to go out to the Pacific, 4-year voyage, and he can hunt for seals, he can trade for sea otter pelts, he's going to pick up sandalwood in the Marquesas and Hawaii, and all of this is bound to China. And so China is where Americans wanted to get the most expensive cargoes then available. So tea and silk, porcelain, but those things weren't paid for in cash. They were all paid for in these commodities that they're getting around the Pacific. And there's lots and lots of ships out there. They're seeing American ships everywhere they go. In fact, by this time, by 1820, American ships outnumber all the ships from Europe combined. And so Americans are really making a big move. Whalemen will be arriving in the Hawaiian Islands the year after this ship leaves there. So there's a lot to go on there. But there's and so what I'm talking about now is from the account book, which is at the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston. And he goes from the coast of California to Hawaii, and there you can see in the page from this account book that he deals directly with King Kamehameha I, or Kamehameha the Great, the king who was the first one to sort of unite all the Hawaiian Islands under his control. And he trades with him a very interesting list of stuff that includes olive oil, paint oil, barrels of flour, rice, sugar, paint and pitch, something called Glauber salts, which were actually used as the medicinal thing at that time. But also paintbrushes, kettles, a skillet, a bake pan, so metal items that they didn't have. But also at this time, Kamehameha was starting to build his own fleet of ships, not on the model of the outrigger canoes with which they had navigated a lot of the Pacific and were expert, but he's beginning to appreciate the nature of American ships, and so he's building them for his own investment in the China trade. And so you can see, if you look at this document on the left-hand side of the page, that in May of 1817, he trades this stuff to Kamehameha. It's worth $4,134.27. But on the right side of the page, he receives 414 pikuls of sandalwood, and a pikul is 133 1/3 pounds. So he's getting about 55,000 pounds of sandalwood, but he doesn't get it until a year later. And this is the beginning of what would see the end of sandalwood in Hawaii, which is the kings of Hawaii buying stuff on credit to pay for later with sandalwood. And Kamehameha was good about paying this stuff on subsequent voyages, but his successors were not so good about paying it back. And finally, in the 1830s, American merchants who now were owed about $80,000 by the Hawaiian kings called the American Navy in to back them up. And that is the point at which sandalwood is absolutely eradicated in the Hawaiian Islands. And it begins the downfall of the Hawaiian monarchy too, the loss of indigenous land. So it's a very interesting thing that we see here. There's also just a little thing down in the bottom left that is so cool to me, and that is that when he's back in August 1st of 1818, he says that he's trading, this is Captain Reynolds, trades 259 pounds of old bought copper procured at Pitcairn Island. So he had gotten that in 1818, which is only 10 years after the Bounty mutineers were rediscovered on Pitcairn Island by a Nantucket whale ship. And so this copper, the bot, B-O-T, I think must mean bottom copper, and it must come from the wreck of the Pitcairn. There's very little else that could be. And for this, he receives 7 piculs of sandalwood at $10 per picul. So that is, again, a lot of sandalwood to bring on to Canton. But in just these 2 pages of this account book is this fabulous story of Americans in the Pacific just about 200 years ago. If you look at that page that shows the trade with King Kamehameha, first of all, it's spelled with a T, Kamehameha, which was common at that time. And the K and the T sound in the Hawaiian language to the English-speaking ear are not easily distinguished. And so we see that a lot in common words like tapa and kapa and taboo and kapu, and also different between Hawaii and Tahiti and the Marquesas, for instance, as they got translated. So that's one of the things that you'll see on that document. But also just the idea that Kamehameha I was a keen manager of the sandalwood trade. When he first realized that there were Americans coming in and carrying this stuff to Canton, he wanted to control it as well as he could. And in fact, in a later page in this very account book, the captain has to pay port charges for anchoring first in the outer harbor of what he calls Wahoo, which is Oahu, and then in the inner harbor, where they're being paid a fairly good amount. Kamehameha had learned from sending his own ship to Canton with sandalwood that he had to pay port charges in Canton, and so that was where he learned he should be doing that as well. Also, he controlled the cutting of the sandalwood with certain ecological ideals, which are familiar to some of the other kinds of managed agriculture and fisheries that we see in various places in the Pacific, so that young trees were not to be cut. They didn't have so much of the fragrant heartwood anyway, but he clearly was looking at this as sort of a long-term trade. And again, tragically, the thing that happened in the next few generations is first of all, there became a really culture of consumption of luxury goods from China and from the U.S. and Europe among the Hawaiian aristocracy, the ali'i. And so they were buying up a lot of stuff, a lot of china, and coaches were sent there. They bought horses that came from South America, but they lived a fairly luxurious lifestyle. When people visited their homes, and a lot of these merchants did go into their homes, they were treated to tea or in silver and porcelain services. So again, it was the paying for that in credit on sandalwood that would become one of the economic factors that really sort of broke down the system in Hawaii.
Mary, can I ask a question?
You certainly can, Jan.
What was that sandalwood worth when it was being sold further?
So these guys are at this time paying about $10, and that's actually Spanish dollars, not American dollars. The U.S. did not actually have coins that were recognized abroad. So the sort of international currency is a Spanish real, or sometimes called the pieces of 8. And so they were then paying $10 per picul. Again, that's 133.3 pounds. And in Canton, then, they're only getting somewhere between $15 and $20 for it at best. In fact, included in the instructions for the captain of this ship the owners say they're beginning to wonder whether or not sandalwood is going to pay off because it's starting to be so expensive in the Pacific Islands where they're getting it, that the profit will not be so great. By the way, this ship cost about $3,500 to outfit and fill with cargo. The return on it was about $120,000. So sea otter pelts and sandalwood could bring you some pretty good cargo from Canton to sell in back in Boston 4 years later.
I love the units of measure. It always reminds me of the ship engineer that he says you can only have 1 cubit of toilet paper.
Well, actually, a picul is a Chinese measurement, which is really interesting. And 1/100th of a picul was called a catty. And that is something that I see too, where pieces of, smaller pieces of sandalwood, when they bind them up and weigh them, they talk about piculs and catties of sandalwood. But it's a Chinese measure that spread across the world. All sandalwood is measured in that unit.
Interesting.
When we talk about what the impacts of these voyages were, they're really environmental impacts and social impacts, and both of those were really tremendous here. I mean, sea otters, and those of us who have spent time in Monterey Bay where they're doing the most research on sea otters, the population between California and Alaska was probably reduced by more than 90% in the first 40 years of the 19th century.
Even today, as we're sailing out there, the extraction, what's being taken has changed. Today, tuna is the blue gold people talk about for the Pacific Islands, and it's certainly an industry that industrial fishing industry that is really making the survival of those pelagic ecosystems difficult. So the issue hasn't gone away.
Right. In fact, I used two examples, one of an extraction and one of an introduction today, that we have seen in sea semester classes. I mean, Sylvia Earle, who spoke to us when we were all together in Monterey last spring, and she used the bluefin tuna, that 90% of bluefin tuna in the Atlantic were killed just between 1970 and 1990. So 20 years in the late 20th century, 90% of that population is extracted. I mean, we haven't changed. We haven't learned anything from that lesson of the 19th century. And the other one, of course, is something that we study a lot too, and that is the introduction of ocean plastics. That the kinds of plastics that are now little pieces of bottles and sandwich bags and other things that we are seeing out there in the ocean in almost every location, and to depths that are astonishing us when we're testing them. Those kinds of plastics have really only been around for about 60 years. And in that amount of time, we have managed to introduce them into the ocean in huge numbers. So it's one of those things that people will often say that we learn from history, but sadly, the evidence would seem to see that we don't. And the other thing in the 19th century, which is, again, a sort of lesson for us, a moral lesson, is that Americans went around and exploited these various resources until they were gone. And then they just moved on to the next one, to the next place. And what they left in their wake, they never bothered to look back to see what did it mean to, Alaska Yupik people in the far north when all the walruses and the whales had been killed along their coast. They had depended on them too, and now they're gone. What happens when sea otters are gone and the ecosystem changes? It's just, it's not the problem of the sailors who by then are off to the next place. And it's why we see sandalwood extracted, first from Fiji till it's gone, then from Marquesas till it's gone, then from Hawaii till it's gone. There's a lesson there to be learned. And, bluefin tuna and plastics, I think, are those common examples of it from which I hope we would learn to change our behavior.
So these are big events for the Pacific environment, and I think you're writing a book more broadly about what this kind of commerce did in the Pacific. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yes, I am looking at 4 things that were extracted from the Pacific by Americans. Sandalwood and sea otters are 2 of them, but I'm also looking at the extraction of marine mammals, whales and seals, which is huge. In fact, when Americans first began to hunt seals on the coast of Chile on the island of Masafuera, in the first season, they took out 54,000 seal pelts. And so you can see that these populations don't last very long. The fourth thing I'm looking at is objects, because I'm interested in museums and in how those things reflect how the trade worked and the indigenous societies. I'm also looking at four things that were introduced. Disease, which was devastating to many populations in the Pacific. In the Marquesas, for instance, the population at the beginning of the 19th century was probably 50 to 100,000. At the end of the 19th century, it was 2,000. So we're looking at just a huge loss of population. I'm looking at the introduction of Christianity, which begins with English and French missionaries, Protestants and Catholics in islands in the Pacific. But two American societies made huge impacts. One is the American Society for Foreign Missions, which went from Boston to Hawaii. And again, the children and grandchildren of the missionaries became the landowners and bankers, and really did lead to the downfall of the monarchy. But the other one is the Mormon Church, which is founded in 1820, and within just a dozen years is already getting missionaries onto whale ships and heading out to the Pacific. And today, as those of us who have sailed around there know, Mormonism is a very substantial religion throughout the Pacific. More than half of Fijians and Tongans, for instance, are Mormons. So I'm looking at diseases and Christianity. I'm also looking at metal tools, which, even though I'm calling this book The Devastating Wake, not everything necessarily is so devastating. Metal tools were quickly adopted because they made almost every activity easier, from canoe building and house building and farming to arts, so that in the Austral Islands, where they had these tiny little shark tooth implements to make very small carvings. A nail sort of revolutionized that, to axes and other things on the northwest coast, where big totemic carvings, totem poles and house fronts and things were really made much more possible by metal tools. And then the last thing is plantation sugar agriculture introduced into Hawaii. Again, a lot of this is done by the children and grandchildren of missionaries. So all these things begin to overlap and tie together in a way that's very interesting. I'm calling the book The Devastating Wake, the impact of Americans in the Pacific in the 19th century, or something like that. Actually, look on my website for the exact title of the book. And it's a very, very interesting process to understand just how enormous the impact of Americans was. In the course of the 19th century, more than 13,000 voyages were made to the Pacific from New England ports. And by 1820, as I said, there were actually more ships from Massachusetts in the Pacific than from all the countries in Europe combined. So it's a really extraordinary number of ships and extraordinary impact that they had.
How big were these ships? What capacity of cargo are we talking about?
It's interesting that you should ask that, because I was looking at the tonnage of the Sultan, for instance, which at 274 tons is, not all that different from the Seamans. It's a little bit shorter. It's like just under 100 feet long. So these were not large vessels. But in terms of, pounds of sandalwood, the Sultan arrived eventually in Canton with close to 80,000 pounds of sandalwood by weight on board. And so the volume of that, plus the seal skins, plus the sea otter pelts, which, the owners told them, whenever you get a chance and see another ship that's owned by us or one of our friends, then they're headed to Canton, put your cargo on there to send it to China. But they end up with a pretty tight hold full of stuff. In fact, those 54,000 seal pelts that were captured by this Captain Edmund Fanning in the very last years of the 18th century, he said that they packed them into the hold, they packed them into a lot of the bunks. Some of the guys had to sleep on the deck. They put seal skins into the boats that they have on the deck to use for going ashore. So it was like everything was filled with seal skins, and they still had to leave some on shore, and then somebody else picked them up later. So it was a it was a massive slaughter of seals. I mean, it was almost like they're, on a rampage against the seals, and then get so many that they can't even fit them all in their own ship. So, yeah, about the size of the Seamans, more room dedicated to storage for cargo than to comfortable berthing for humans. But yeah, I think in many ways, the sort of experience of what it feels like to be on the ship and motion and everything is very similar.
The Seaman's obviously on its way now to San Diego, so these waters where the ship is from. They're anticipating taking approximately 3 weeks for that passage, using sails as much as possible, probably doing motor sailing there, here and there as well. Do you have a sense of how long these ships took to make the trip from Hawaii to the West Coast?
Yeah, actually, I have it right in this particular thing. It was 35 days. So it's not all that different, I think, from what the Seamans is doing under sail. And again, they knew what the currents were, so that they don't approach the coast of California directly from Hawaii without going first to Alaska and making their way down the coast where they know they're going to be sailing with the current. That kind of information was fairly regularly shared. And in fact, the owners say stuff about that in the instructions to the captain.
All right, well, that wraps it up for this episode. Thanks for joining us on this. Be sure to check out Mary's website, marymalloy.net. Jan, Mary, and I worked together a sea semester program just less than a year ago. So always nice to have a little reunion here. Look for another broadcast next week, and be sure to check out the links to the Esri Story Map Journal for more on the North Pacific and entries from the sea semester faculty. Thanks for watching.